Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Thursday, December 15th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Peach Bowl game against Georgia is in 16 days, the game against Michigan in 345 days. As we are counting down the days to that Peach Bowl, we haven't really talked a lot about the matchup of those two teams just yet, but we're going to do that today. My guest is Ross Fulton of BuckeyeHuddle.com. Ross, when I look at Georgia's team, it looks kind of like Michigan in some ways, maybe with a few upgrades here and there. We were talking before we hit record. I said, is Georgia just Michigan plus? And you said, sort of, but kind of not. So explain why Georgia is not just Michigan plus.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the first thing offensively, they're a much more pass happy team. I guess pass happy probably overstates it. I think they threw the ball, I think Ohio State threw it 46% of the time this year, Georgia 47% of the time. So by contrast, I think Michigan was in the 30s. So Georgia is much more of a pass relief heavy team. They throw a ton of screens. They do use a bunch of two tight ends like Michigan does, but they do it somewhat differently. They move those guys around a lot. They use them a lot as blockers for screens or on screens. I mean, Brock Bowers is kind of like a big wide receiver as opposed to a true inline tight end. So, I mean, I think offensively they present some different challenges. And then, I mean, defensively, to me, Michigan defensively is not a star-driven unit. They play really well doing what they do. But Georgia is, I mean, we could do an hour and a half on all the stuff about the Saban Kirby Smart defense and what Kirby Smart's done. But first and foremost, you have to deal with Jalen Carter, number 88. Every play has to be revolve around that. And from there, I think they've been fairly vulnerable against the pass. So I do think there's some opportunities that we can talk about.
Well, then let's talk about that, because I was going to ask you, how do you attack Georgia? And it feels like we've talked about a bunch of these teams this year, like Michigan, for example, as being how much has their secondary really been challenged this year? Kind of got to take some shots, and they did sort of, but not many, maybe as many as you'd expect, but that might have been partly a function of Michigan just kind of keeping everything in front of them and trying to stay back and not give up those deep shots and make you be a little more methodical going down the field. So how do you attack, how would you attack Georgia? And if the answer is try and throw it over their head sometimes, if they're going to be, kind of conservative and try and keep things in front of them, like you've maybe seen other teams try to do to Ohio State, then what do you do? What's the counterpunch if that's what their punch is?
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State should have definitely taken some more shots against Michigan. But that was both in terms of, I think that's, I guess, obviously a different conversation. As much on, Stroud needs to take some chances. They need to push it more to Harrison. And that applies, though, equally to Georgia. LSU had a really good game plan. Frankly, Kentucky had a really good game plan as well against Georgia's. They run a ton of man match cover 4. They call, Saban and Smart call it cover 7. There's tons of rules, but long story short, you have to start with using the pass as a ball control option. LSU had a ton of success running spacing routes, snag routes, underneath, 5 to 10 yard routes where you're getting the ball out. You're taking advantage of the rules of that defense and the leverage of them playing outside in. And then from there, you then have to take advantage. You got to hit your shots downfield. You will get one-on-one matchups outside. LSU hit them on a lot of dig routes. Again, sort of taking it, pull the safety out, target the corner. Slot fades are going to be there against, and work the ball against linebackers. They're difficult to run on. I mean, we talked about Carter. They use a lot of odd fronts. They use a tight front, or what Kirby Smart, Nick Saban, called mint. So they'll put someone head up over the nose. They'll put two guys in between the guards and the tackles. That's where Carter is, and then they'll have an outside linebacker. And it makes it really hard to run inside zone plays. I think and Ohio State hasn't been all that great on gap runs, and they will blow pullers up, and they'll blow Ohio State's tight ends up trying to block back on split zone. So I do think a lot of it is going to be, I actually liked how Ohio State kind of targeted Michigan early. They spread them out more. They use mid zone. They use more reliefs. I think it's going to have to be a similar thing. I think, I know that outside zone has been sort of a bet noir among Ohio State fans this year, but I think particularly against like the off front, that's the way to go. Use fast motion with the tight end to try to get leverage. Try to get the ball outside, attack the seams and the C gaps. But I really think this comes down to like you do need to have some semblance of a run game, and hopefully Ohio State's, for their sake, gets healthier in the backfield. But really, it's like stay ahead of the chains with the passing game and target Georgia that way.
And you mentioned trying to take maybe more shots downfield, and they should have been a little more aggressive against Michigan. We've heard Ryan Day, I think a couple times now, talk about the fact that you look at these playoff games and you're not winning these playoff games 20-17. The winning team more often than not is in the high 30s, low 40s, maybe even in the high 40s, low 50s. So that to me suggests he's probably going to be more aggressive in terms of fourth down decision making, in terms of maybe being able to take more shots, because Georgia has been a pretty darn good red zone defense over the last couple of years. They were 31 and 32% or 29 and 32% or something like that over the last 2 years in terms of touchdowns in the red zone. And so one way, if you're not scoring touchdowns in the red zone, if that's kind of difficult for you, one way to get in there is to, before you get to the red zone, throw the ball over the top and get it into the end zone. And, write that down, kids. That's good advice. Throw long touchdowns. So is this something that, this is sort of going against sort of what Ohio State has done over the last few years. They've sort of, going back to Justin Fields, they've been a little bit cautious about not throwing into, if you don't see it downfield, maybe check it down. When they throw it downfield, it's guys who are wide open. Are they going to be willing to take more chances in this kind of game? Or it feels like that's something they almost have to do, doesn't it?
I think so. I think that Stroud needed to take more chances against Michigan. There were opportunities to throw back shoulder, one-on-one throws to Harrison. It's a progression-based system, right? You read the coverage. Stroud's really good at reading the coverage and going where the ball is or where it should go. But there are times to make plays. But that also goes to, yes, I think they need to score at least above 35. You cannot have, to your point, and one of your and I's favorite discussions, you cannot just keep punting on fourth downs in situations where, statistically, it really hurts you to punt on fourth down. Obviously, we can, against Michigan, put in the fake punt that was a blown assignment aside. There were two other fourth and shorts where they punted that were, really poor decision, at least by the analytics. And so, you need to come up with a plan. I think that Emeka Egbuka, again, he's someone who is kind of got hurt in the middle of the season. He had a bit of a drop off, perhaps as a result. That's where your matchup is. You take advantage of Georgia will bracket Harrison a lot probably, and take advantage of that with Egbuka, putting them to the same side, moving him in motion. You need to hit a lot of H outs. It has to be a big game for him, and you're gonna have to keep swinging. Both statistically and schematically. Obviously the plan against Michigan and a lot of those high leverage, third and short, fourth and short, red zone situations was to use kind of throwback or misdirection plays to the tight end, and that I think in theory on paper some of them made sense. Obviously the execution was no contested catches were made, so I think you kind of have to scrap that and go with your guys that can make plays and work, continue to keep swinging.
On the Buckeye Weekly podcast, Tony Gerderman and I are kind of going through a bunch of Georgia's key games this month and rewatching those. So we watched Oregon and we watched Missouri, we watched Tennessee this week. We're going to get to that Kentucky game and the LSU game in the coming week before Christmas. But, watching that Tennessee game, it was interesting because you're looking at Tennessee and they're in a hostile road environment and the crowd's very loud. But there was a lot of just the dumb stuff that you've seen from Ohio State this year. Just really badly timed false starts, defense missing tackles, settling for field goals in the red zone, having guys open downfield and just not connecting on those passes. You just sort of saw It was just like all of the stuff that Ohio State can't do against Georgia, that was what Tennessee was doing against Georgia. Is that stuff that's fixable? Is that stuff that is, it's not just you're making mistakes, the defense is causing you to make mistakes, and the offense is causing you to make mistakes? How much of that is fixable stuff for Ohio State, and how much is stuff they're either going to have to very intentionally, like we were talking about changing your mindset on fourth down and that kind of stuff. Is that stuff that Ohio State can fix, or is that stuff that you're worried you might see again in Atlanta on New Year's Eve?
No, I mean, I think it depends on the category, right? But yeah, I mean, they're going to have to, they're going to have to play with tempo, and in doing so, they can't have false starts, right? So that stuff, that's just execution. You can't drop balls. You can't blow assignments on defense and coverage, or hesitate in the backfield when you're supposed to be responsible for the running back and cover zero and let him go by. There were obviously individual execution, just complete mistakes against Michigan that, you're playing a really good team. You have to play well. There are areas, I think, fourth down, I take Ryan Day at his word that he recognizes this is just me reading a lot between the lines. I think he probably wishes he had some of that back and realizes he's gotten too tight and sort of needs to go back to some of his roots on that. Versus Georgia, I worry for Ohio State about short yardage and red zone. I've seen too many times now where teams have good drives going against Georgia, and it gets to 3rd and 1, and they kind of bang their head into the wall, and Georgia loves bringing, they'll bring field pressure and run situations and get stuffed on inside zone in the backfield because, they're standing up the offensive line. So it's going to take, a lot of, whether that's going back to being heavy in short yardage situations, whether it's trying to use jet sweeps, whether it's trying to get Stroud outside the pocket to hit Harrison. I mean, I do think it's going to take a lot of focus on those areas. Again, similar red zone, you got to come up with a plan to, Ohio State's first touchdown against Michigan, get Ibuka singled up if they want to double Harrison, or get ways to get Harrison the ball. And so, that's going to be the challenge, I think, is really those situations. Because, yeah, I mean, I think it goes without saying that against a really good team like Georgia, you got to hit your shots downfield when they're there. You got to execute.
And then on the other side of the ball, as we mentioned off the top of the show, Georgia's offense, you think of Georgia and it's okay, well, they're going to run the ball and they're going to play good defense. And, well, they're throwing the ball. They throw the ball more than Tennessee throws the ball, which is wild to think about, because I think if you asked people, you'd say Tennessee is the really pass-happy offense and Georgia's the really run-heavy, and it's actually the opposite. I actually read something from Bill Connolly from ESPN earlier this week about how Georgia is not that great at downfield passing. He was sort of looking at the playoff matchups and said, Georgia is really not a particularly good downfield passing team, but neither was Michigan. And then you all saw how that game played out. So, are the issues that Ohio State had on those downfield passes, is that something that is fixable in time for this game? Because it feels like the threat posed by Georgia's pass offense with, they've got a bunch of receivers and none of them are huge. Ladd McConkey had put up some pretty decent numbers this year, but, Arian Smith had one long catch, but then had a huge one against Tennessee. So, plus you've got the tight ends, which we talked about them earlier. I mean, it feels like you're sort of set up for, okay, Georgia shouldn't be able to throw the ball downfield against Ohio State, but Michigan shouldn't have been able to, and then they could. So are those issues fixable, or is that something that is, potentially another really significant issue looming for Ohio State?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Ohio State fans have also complained at times this season about wide receiver screens. If you don't like wide receiver screens, you're going to love watching Georgia, because they throw a ton of them. Running back swing screens, flash screens, now screens, bubble screens. It's a big part of what they do. So you have to be ready for that. You have to have some kind of plan to bracket Bowers. Similar to what Knowles did against Michael Mayer for Notre Dame. I mean, even if it's a linebacker and a safety, some sort of way to, and then, the Michigan game, it's such a weird one, because I wouldn't really say that Michigan had a ton of. I mean, they obviously did have downfield success throwing, but it's like it's 5 plays that you can all think of in your head. So whether it's the third down where Cam Brown missed a tackle and Jack Sawyer wasn't hustling to get to the football, and that led to a touchdown, or you put in your backup nickel for reasons that still haven't been described, and you get burnt for a touchdown. That's 2. Latham Ranson gets turned around in coverage and tries to be overly aggressive and jump a dig route, and they run up the field, and that's 3. So I mean, that's those. So again, some of those are, whether that was the right time to call a cover 0 7-man blitz, I still question that. Like, you got to get people on the ground, but you just really like have to do your assignments. I mean, like, Latham Ranson has played well this year until that game where he was just kind of out of control in terms of not, doing his job. And so you just really, I think that they can do a better job because we've seen them do a better job of executing over the previous 11 games. And so you wonder how much of that was just like overhype for Michigan and just like too focused. I'm hearing 364 days about how much they needed to stop the run game and got out toughed, and that sort of backfired in their face. And I think, I mean, Knowles' defense, like, certainly, as that Bill Conley stat you talked about, I mean, like, they certainly have had a proclivity for giving up big plays. That's not really Georgia's go-to. I think that I worry again about like Bowers down the seam off a hard play action, but I think that there isn't reason to just think just because Ohio State executed probably as poorly as they had all season against Michigan, that's going to translate over. I mean, even if Ohio State played Michigan again, I wouldn't think that the Michigan path to victory is 6 plays over 60 yards. I mean, that's just sort of not a repeatable outcome.
Well, and having watched Georgia a few of the games already this year, when you watch the Missouri game, Missouri's getting consistent pressure on Stetson Bennett, and Stetson Bennett looks very uncomfortable and is missing throws, and he had wide receivers dropping balls that game too, but he was he was too far, too short, back, too far back shoulder. He just looked off rhythm. And we watched the Oregon game first, where he looked like touchdown robot, just pumping balls in right on time to wide open receivers. And then you get pressure in his face, and all of a sudden he looked real uncomfortable at times against Missouri. So will Ohio State be able to get pressure without having to resort to a bunch of 6-man blitzes or something like that? Are they going to be able to get pressure with the defensive front, or is that, how do you get Georgia looking uncomfortable if you're Jim Knowles?
Yeah, I would not call Bennett the most accurate quarterback I've ever seen. I mean, Stroud's more accurate. He can be a little inconsistent, I think, at times. I think Ohio State can generate pressure. I mean, I don't think that Knowles is going to stop blitzing. I mean, I'd like to see him change it up more like he was earlier in the season and using more like, 4 or 5-man pressures, and not just always resorting to like cover 0 ones. But, Georgia's, I mean, I would consider their offensive line. I mean, I know their left tackle is pretty highly thought of at NFL draft circles, but you see that he might be a guard, and I could at the NFL level, and I could kind of see that. Like, they're very big bodied guys. I do think that Ohio State's going to be able to generate some pressure. I do think, though, that, I mean, we do talk about how Georgia's more of a pass team, but, like, the first and foremost is, like, Ohio State is going to have to stop the run and, like, be prepared to defend duo and counter Trey and a lot of the things that Michigan does. So, again, I don't think the path to victory in this game is Ohio State winning 24-21. So I do think in that sense, like, Knowles' game plan against Michigan made sense in a world where you're like not punting on 4th and 2 from from the Michigan 45-yard line or whatever. So there does need to be some meshing up there of what's going on. I think that I just expect the defense to play better, like, just because like that execution was just so poor. But it's interesting too, because to flip it around, like, Georgia doesn't generate a lot of organic pressure either. Like, they do not, like, Carter inside again. Like, I thought LSU did a good job of they slid the protection to him most of the time. So you had like a center and a guard generally accounting for him. Like, you have to account for him, but like, their defensive ends are not going to generate a ton of pressure. Like, Georgia, Kirby Smart's like happy to use like 4-man creepers or 5-man sim pressures, like, or 5-man fire zones if he's like not getting pressure to try to start to generate some. But like, I think that Stroud should have time to throw, assuming that they adequately account for Carter.
All right. Well, I'm going to guess this is not going to be the last time we'll talk to Ross before the Peach Bowl, because I feel like there is a lot more to talk about. We heard Ross a couple of times earlier say, "Boy, I could talk about that for an hour." So I don't know. Maybe we'll see if we can find an hour to talk to Ross at some point. Maybe while we're down in Atlanta, or even before we head out for Christmas. But yes, there should be a lot more to talk about. And one of the great places to talk about it is all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Ross is one of our 4 insiders. Covering the X's and O's and scheme side of things. Him, Michael Pettit, Justin Whitlatch, Devin Radcliffe. Lots of really smart football minds all talking about exactly what we just talked about there. Lots of schematic stuff, good breakdowns, just making you a little bit of a smarter football fan, letting you know what you're looking at during the game and what you saw but maybe didn't understand before. So that is a great reason to join BuckeyeHuddle.com, but there are plenty more than that. Alex Gleitman and Mark Givler working overtime this week as we head into early signing day on the 21st. And of course, Tony Gerdeman, Kevin Noonan, and I all covering the team as well. There's a little bit of stuff to talk about there, as well as we head into the last couple weeks before the Peach Bowl. Should be a very eventful time at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We hope you can join us there. Thank you guys all for joining us here. We will talk to you tomorrow.